How easy or hard is it to immigrate to the United States? I'm Dan Ringer, and we'll talk about immigration right now on The LawWorks.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
How are all of these foreigners getting into the United States? My guest is attorney Robert Whitehill. Bob, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
When we talk about people getting into the United States, typically we're talking about immigration of one sort or another. At one point in time, a bunch of folks from Europe could get in a boat, land on a rock, and they were here. Of course, it wasn't the United States in those days, but that's kind of where we started. How has it changed over the years?
Well, it changes, immigration changes frequently. It changes based upon the economy, it changes upon the sociology of our country, it changes upon our need for laborers, it changes based upon how we look at ourselves. Early on, as you suggest, there were very few immigration laws. There's the Alien Sedition Act, so no traders were allowed. During the 19th century, when there was a great need for laborers, the country was open, pretty much open. There were health-related grounds of inadmissibility or preventions from coming to the U.S. And then in the 1920s, well, the United States looked at itself and said, we got too many of those and too many of the others. It was sociological. And there were restrictions placed on the people who were able to come. In the 1960s, post-World War II, those restrictions were not based upon where a person came from, but based upon where a person, based upon family reunification, based upon the skills that a person had, based upon asylum, seeking refuge in the United States. And from about that time, from the 1960s on, the Immigration Act of 1965, the system has been pretty much in place the way it is today. Lots of discussion about changing this and changing that, but there are ways that people can come in legally, and there are ways that people come in illegally, unfortunately.
Well, classically, when we think about immigration, we get this image of Ellis Island. And as I understand the process at that time, if you could get onto a boat and get to the United States, you would go to some portal like Ellis Island, where basically if you were healthy enough to be able to support yourself, you were home, you were in.
That's basically right. From the early 1880s to I think 1917 or so, Ellis Island resettled. Through Ellis Island, millions were resettled, and I think your description of that is accurate. People coming to JFK, which is not very far from Ellis Island, right, have a dramatically different experience.
What's the experience now?
Well, for most people coming to the United States, they need a visa. And they need to go to a U.S. consulate and demonstrate that the reason that they are coming to the United States is a lawful one, that they're going to abide by the law, that they are not people who have done things or may do things in the United States which are a threat to the United States or would otherwise make them, the term is, inadmissible. So that's the first thing. There needs to be a visa that most people have to get. Stop in at the U.S. consul. They get the visa in their passport, they come to the United States, mostly by air today, and they are inspected by an immigration officer, Customs and Border Protection is what it's called, at the port of entry. The technology today is amazing. The technology at Ellis Island was probably the officer looked at the person, sized him or her up, and moved on. Here, there's a lot of technology where people's history and background can be discerned from their passport because there's an information chip inside it.
An information chip, a computer chip?
A computer chip inside your passport. Your U.S., that nice blue U.S. passport has got a computer chip inside
But
it.
do other countries use passports like that?
Almost all, yes.
Okay.
Almost.
So more or less your history's in that document.
Your history and indeed your identity. So if I come to a port of entry and say, I'm Dan Ringer, and present a passport, it'll say, you know what? You don't look like Dan Ringer, and your fingerprint is just not the same as his.
Wait, they take your fingerprints there too?
Yeah.
Okay. Then what?
Well, then you're admitted. Then the individual is admitted to the United States. So there's a fair bit of security that precedes a person's entry into the United States. Then the person is admitted and is admitted as a visitor or as a student or as a temporary worker, as admitted as a fiancé, admitted as the spouse of a U.S. citizen, admitted for a particular purpose, perhaps for a limited period of time, which is known as a non-immigrant visa, or maybe admitted for a permanent period of time, which would be a permanent residency or a green card, which allows a person to stay in the U.S. as long as he or she wants and abides by the law.
Let's go back to the very first step of all that. You have to get a visa to be allowed to come here.
Yep.
It's not as simple as going in and filling out an application with all of the information that you talked about and then being awarded a visa. There can be significant delays.
There certainly can be significant delays. It's 2010. There are security concerns around the world. Many people are delayed in returning to a job in the United States because of security concerns that the consul needs to check out. There are, however, a number of countries, developed countries in Europe and Japan, Korea, Australia, where the individual doesn't need to stop at the consul. You fill out, you go online, fill out a set of documents. You arrive in the United States, and you're allowed to come in for 90 days. And the reason for that is the level of fraud from those countries is really small. And in exchange for not having to visit the consul, your visit is limited to 90 days, and then you got to go home. But other than that, if you want to work in the U.S., it's a rigorous process.
If you come from a country full of decent people, the process is pretty easy?
I wouldn't put it that way.
No, you wouldn't.
If it's a low-fraud country and there's a treaty between the U.S. and that country allowing U.S. citizens to go to that country without having to stop at their consul, then this visa waiver program would apply.
I have heard allusions to long waiting periods in some countries to get permission to come to the United States. How does that work?
It works really poorly. But how does it work? There are a limited number of visas. Let me take a step backwards. There are temporary visas that we've talked about, coming to visit friends, to go to be a tourist. There are also permanent residency visas or green cards based upon family reunification or employment. A limited number of those visas per year. It's not open borders or open immigration the way it was in the 1880s during the Ellis Island time. Limited number of visas, and in order to promote diversity among those people who come to the United States, no one country can predominate. So what do I mean by that? So no more than a certain percentage of the total visas can be allocated to people from a certain country, to any given country. Two biggest countries in the world, India, China. People who are from India and China have to wait a very long period of time for employment-based immigration because there's a limited number of these visas and a very strong demand. On the family side, all the categories of family-based immigration have a long wait. The longest waits are for brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. Those relatives may have to wait 20 years to get a visa to come to the U.S.
We're talking about immigration. My guest is attorney Robert Whitehill. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. 20 years?
Yes, sir. 20 years.
Brothers and sisters, in the immigration law, there are classifications defined of family members who can come, and it includes spouses, children, brothers and sisters. How far out into the family do these classifications go?
There are two different types of family reunification visas. One for an immediate relative.
How immediate is that?
Okay, an immediate relative. Thank you. That's a good tee-off for this one. A spouse of a U.S. citizen, a parent of a U.S. citizen, that is an immediate relative. A minor child of a U.S. citizen, that's an immediate relative. And for them, there are no numerical limits. However, adult children of U.S. citizen, adult married children of U.S. citizens, there are long waits. For brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, ridiculous waits. And for spouses of permanent residents and children of permanent residents, a very long wait. Permanent resident is a person who's got a green card, who has a right to live and work in the United States, and eventually has the right to apply for naturalization to become a U.S. citizen.
So if someone comes over here, gets in properly, and says, now I want to bring my husband or my wife, they're going to have to wait a long time?
Could very well be, yes.
But the philosophy of the United States is to promote families.
Family reunification.
Family reunification.
Right.
And while I appreciate the ability to bring my maybe elderly mother or father in right now, I might well like to have my wife here right now.
It's a real problem. And people do stage their time, is probably a better way, do time their weddings based upon their immigration status. Because they know darn good and well if they get their green card and then find the love of their life outside of the U.S., it's a terrible way to start a wedding. It's a horrible way to start a life together, being separated for 4 or 5 years.
Of course, there have been movies made about the person who is a citizen marrying the non-permanent resident, somebody who's here on a temporary visa.
Yep.
And I guess they get to stay then,
Well,
if they're already here?
okay, so there are movies about the fraud that's involved.
Right.
And there is fraud, there's no doubt about it. But the immigration officers, I like to tell my clients, have a sixth sense. They can tell when the marriage is for the purpose of immigration.
Yeah, the problem with that, though, is I know a lot of federal prosecutors and U.S. Marshals and people like that, and they have that same sixth sense. And so we don't need trials and courts and things like that.
Right.
Sometimes they're wrong.
No, point well taken. So the way Congress has developed the system is that if the couple has been married for less than 2 years, then the alien, the foreign spouse, receives what's called a conditional permanent residency, good for 2 years. At the end of those 2 years, that U.S. citizen and the alien spouse need to go back to immigration and say, okay, we're here. And in the last 2 years, here's what we've done together. And here are our pictures of our Christmases together. And here is the house that we bought together. And don't you like Junior? Isn't he a handsome little boy? Doesn't he look like that?
I often tell people in family law matters, divorce, marriage, things like that, that so far as the government is concerned, a marriage is the registration of a business to acquire assets and produce children. And so I guess immigration wants to see the assets and the children.
Yeah.
And you have about a four-year window there?
It's a 2-year.
2-year window.
So I get married to a foreign national. I got into this field because I married a foreign national. So I come by it naturally. If I were to marry her today and go through the process, she'd get a conditional permanent residency first, and then 2 years later we'd file together, assuming we're still together, to remove the condition, which would allow her then to get a full and unrestricted green card or permanent residency or right to live in the U.S. On the other hand, if this was a marriage that was, fraudulent, it's not going to be granted. The permanent residency is not going to be granted. If the immigration officer believes that it's a fraud, that person is going to be subject to being removed from the United States.
And that's something subject to being removed that we haven't talked about and really is beyond the scope of this program. That involves words like deportation and,
Yes, sir.
and things of that sort. And there are sometimes long and involved processes and sometimes very quick processes by which someone may be removed from the United States and sent back to wherever they were from.
Well, that's exactly right. Not to dwell on it, there is an immigration judge. The immigration judge needs to make a decision on the merits of the case brought by the government against the individual. The individual is entitled to a trial, entitled to what's known as due process of law. It's a civil matter, it's not a criminal matter, and so unlike in a criminal case where there is a attorney that's appointed for that criminal defendant, in immigration matters, an attorney is not appointed.
You have no right to an attorney.
You have a right to, the way the law reads.
You're permitted to have one,
Right.
but you're not going to be given one.
That's right, at your own expense.
We're talking about immigration. My guest is attorney Robert Whitehill. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. We heard tales, I say we heard because most of us aren't old enough now to know about it, but following World War II, there were this concept of war brides, not necessarily female, could be male, but a soldier would be serving overseas, would meet someone, would get married, and then bring that person back to the United States. I suppose we can do that now by saying that that person is my spouse, but there can be long delays in bringing that war bride spouse into the United States now. But there's another classification of immigrant. It's classified under humanitarian admission, I guess.
Oh, okay.
So if you were in a place that had been devastated by some sort of natural disaster or some catastrophe of some sort, and you married them, you could bring them back. They would be admitted for humanitarian reasons.
Well, we're talking about two different things.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about humanitarian parole. One of the reasons people come to the United States is to save their lives, whether it's to save their lives from oppression at the hands of some tyrant, or save their lives from a medical condition where they receive advanced medical care. People are able to enter the United States. The consuls are allowed to grant humanitarian paroles or humanitarian visas to people who will be treated here in Morgantown or treated in Pittsburgh or treated at Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York, and will have their lives saved by the availability of physicians in hospitals that are just not available in their homeland. That's not a very frequent occurrence, so don't misunderstand me. That happens, but it doesn't happen all that often. By and large, you've got to play the game, if you will, by the rules, and the rules are pretty tough when it comes to coming to the United States. But indeed, there are humanitarian instances. Talk about war brides. Sometimes war brides, the spouses, mostly wives, of servicemen find themselves in the United States in a situation where they're going to be subject to removal because they've done something wrong, they entered without inspection, they walked across the border, and they're not allowed to do that. There has been some level of tolerance, not a lot, some level of tolerance by immigration, giving a benefit to the spouses of military personnel. Just recently, Congress passed a law called a private bill, allowing one particular soldier's widow who had no legal rights because the husband died to stay in the United States. Congress passed a law for that one particular widow of that one particular soldier. So things of a very personal humanitarian nature do happen. It's not all that often.
She was already in the United States?
She was already in the United States.
And because she was a widow, and whatever circumstances surrounded that, they allowed her to stay.
That's right.
The general rule is that you can't pass laws to benefit just one person or just one company, but we do in cases like this.
In extraordinary cases, if there are 100 private bills passed a year, that's a heck of a lot. At the top of the show, you talked about millions, 12 million lawful people in the United States who are foreign nationals, who are legally here, and another 11 million who are not legally here. Those are gargantuan numbers. Those are almost mind-blowing numbers. And having 100 per year being granted special permission is extraordinary.
And that 100 per year comes out of a much larger pool of private bills that are introduced to allow someone to come or stay.
Absolutely. And members of Congress don't want to touch them by and large.
It's kind of interesting because under the humanitarian classification, I did not mention that Bob practices immigration law in the Pittsburgh area and teaches as an adjunct professor at West Virginia University's College of Law, which is how I met him. In Pittsburgh, you have major teaching hospitals. In West Virginia, at Morgantown, we have a major teaching hospital. So those of us in those communities frequently hear about somebody coming in from overseas to have some sort of tremendously complex or important surgery. But other parts of the United States, you just never encounter those people. There's no reason for them to be in rural West Virginia or rural Pennsylvania. They wouldn't be there, so we wouldn't hear about them.
Well, that's right in terms of those people who would be getting this extraordinary medical care. But in every part of the United States, there are people who are not born here. My guess is maybe in this building there's somebody who was not born here. So the number of non-native born Americans, non-native born residents of this country is about 10% of our population. And so while you're absolutely right, the extraordinary cases of health care being delivered to a foreign national make the news.
They're the exceptions.
They're certainly the exception.
Once somebody is here, can they be, well, we know they can. How can they become a citizen of the United States?
The process is, I like to describe it as you crawl and then you walk and then you run. You come into the United States on a temporary visa, a non-immigrant visa. You change from that to a permanent residency and get a green card or permanent residency in the United States. When a person has been a permanent resident of the United States for 5 years, that person is eligible to apply to become a citizen. Unless that person is married to a U.S. citizen and has been married for 3 years to that U.S. citizen, then after 3 years the person may apply to be naturalized. To be naturalized, a person needs to read, write, and speak simple English. A person needs to have some basic knowledge of American history, government, and civics. A person needs to be an individual of good moral character. The person needs to have spent most of his or her time as a permanent resident in the United States. So there are a number of different requirements, but indeed millions of people have been able to be naturalized by going through the crawling, walking, and running of immigration.
Well, I've got about 3 more pages of questions here, but unfortunately I don't have any more time to ask them. Bob Whitehill, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Dan. It was fun.
Thank you also for being with us on behalf of the LawWorks. I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. On the LawWorks webpage at thelawworks.org, you'll find a listing of recent The LawWorks program topics and additional information about this show's topic. If you would like to recommend this program to a friend, you'll find a video of the program at the LawWorks website. You'll also find free video and podcasts of previous programs on YouTube and iTunes. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future program, or if you're a school teacher and would like to receive a free copy of this show for classroom use, send us an email to thelawworks@comcast.net.
The Law Works is produced in cooperation with the West Virginia State Bar, the Mountain State Bar, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The Law Works is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.